My name is Grace McAllister and I work for Causeway Coast and Glens Heritage Trust. So my role there is to promote the heritage of the Causeway Coast area of outstanding natural beauty. So it's great that we can all be gathered here tonight to kind of learn and explore a bit about how people who were living here thousands of years ago have shaped the landscape we see today. So thank you all for coming. It's great to have so many of you here. Before I introduce Alison, who's speaking tonight, I just want to say a few thank yous. So thank you, first of all, to Ballintoy Archaeological and Historical Society and the Reverend Patrick Barton for hosting us this evening. Betty, who has organised tea for later as well, and Margaret as well. Thank you very much to both of you. And Nick Wright from Causeway Coast and Glens Museum Service, who has organised Chrissy to be here with us tonight to film the talk so that those who couldn't join us tonight will be able to get to experience the talk as well. And of course, Alison for being here tonight, who flew over from Scotland today to join us. It's great to have you there. And this talk and the excavation at the Druid Stone, which was a couple of weeks ago or a few weeks ago, was only possible through funding that Alison and Archaeology Scotland applied for from the Department of Communities, their Historic Environment Fund. So thank you very much, Alison. Really appreciate that your research is having an impact here. So I just want to introduce Alison. Some of you will know her already. So like I say, Alison was here a couple of weeks ago at the end of January, a few very wet and windy days, doing an excavation at the Druid Stone just behind the rectory and Maurice McHenry's farm. So it'd been lovely if you'd been here today because it was beautiful weather compared to what we had in January. And of course, as well, Alison was here actually in February 2024 when we had a gathering of the Friends of Ballycastle Museum, Ballintoy Archaeological and Historical Society and the Glens of Antrim Historical Society. We all came together for a workshop to look at some of the connections between the prehistoric tombs here in North Antrim and those in the Western Isles of Scotland. But Alison's connection to Northern Ireland started many years ago. So she completed her PhD at Cambridge University, and that was on the Irish Neolithic in the late 70s and early 80s. And then she served as Junior Fellow at the Institute of Irish Studies at Queen's University. During that time, she taught at Queen's and also for the Workers' Educational Association and lived in Belfast throughout the Troubles. So she knows the place and the archaeology very well. After leaving Northern Ireland in 1987, Alison went on to spend more than 30 years at the National Museum Scotland in Edinburgh, where she served first as curator and then as principal curator of early prehistory. Although she officially retired 6 years ago, as she says herself, there's no such thing as retirement in archaeology, so you're as busy as ever and continuing to research, publish and carry out fieldwork. Many of you will recognise Alison actually probably from appearances on the likes of Time Team. So you were involved in the excavation at Knockdhu, just outside Larne, that was in 2009. And then also when the dig was happening at the Druid Stone, Helen Mark came out and you were on Kintra radio show a couple of weeks ago too. So Alison's contribution to archaeology has been widely recognised. She is currently Vice President of Archaeology Scotland and a council member for the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland. She served as President of the Prehistoric Society from 2010 to 2014, a Fellow of the British Academy and of the Society of Antiquity. There's a word I can't say here. Antiquaries of both Scotland and London, and in 2018 was awarded the Graham Clark Medal for outstanding contributions to prehistoric archaeology. In 2020, she delivered the prestigious Rind Lectures, a 6-part series on the Scottish Neolithic, and those lectures are still available to watch. So tonight, her talk, From Brittany to Ballintoy, Exploring Northern Ireland's Earliest Megalithic Monuments, will explore the fascinating links between Brittany and some of our own earliest monuments here in Northern Ireland. Through the archaeology, the artefacts and the new research, we'll gain some insight into the connections between those ancient communities over 5,000 years ago. So please welcome Alison for me.
Thank you very, very much, Grace, for that lovely introduction. And I'm so over the moon to be here tonight. It's just wonderful to be back. And thank you for coming along to hear about the results of a small but highly productive excavation that Cormac McSparran and I carried out in mid-January at the Druid Stone Monument up the hill just behind us. Thanks to, as you're saying, the generous funding from the Historic Environment Division of Northern Ireland, and with huge, huge help from Grace too. And all the other people that you mentioned. And we're really, really grateful. And I know that many of you braved that inclement weather on that stormy, rainy day on the 20th of January to hear my brief spiel in the farmer's shed before heading up on that slippery, muddy slope to the site. So it's very nice to be able to bring you news of what we found and what we've been doing since then in the comfort and warmth of this lovely church hall. But first, I need to set the scene and explain why we're up there in the first place. And I also need to explain what on earth Brittany has got to do with Ballintoy. But I won't be explaining it in French. You'll be relieved to hear. Well, way back in the late 70s and early 80s, last millennium, when I was doing my PhD on the Irish Neolithic, I became fascinated with the question about what are the earliest megalithic monuments in Ireland, who built them, and where they could have come from. This is all part of trying to understand why and when farming as a new way of life appeared and became established in Ireland and Britain, since it was such a stark contrast to the hunting, fishing and foraging way of life that Ireland and Britain's Mesolithic inhabitants had led since the 9th millennium BC. How did we get from that way of life, based as it was on moving around seasonally to take advantage of whatever wild foods came into season, to this way of life, which was based on the production? You produce your own food through cultivating cereals and other non-native plants, and the keeping of domesticated cattle, sheep, and possibly goats as well, and pigs, along with a little hunting and foraging of wild foods. But interestingly, they didn't eat fish or sea mammals, and this would have been a cultural choice. Well, people have been arguing the toss about this for the best part of a century, with some arguing that Ireland and Britain's Mesolithic groups sailed over the continent and observed people farming there and brought back the idea and the nuts and bolts of farming. While others, including myself, have argued that this new way of life and all the novel practices and beliefs that went with it, including making pottery, which was a wholly new technology, and building monuments for the dead, had been introduced by groups of farmers who migrated here for various reasons from the near continent. On one thing, though, everybody had to agree, and that is that those nuts and bolts of a farming way of life, the domesticated plants and animals, must have been brought over from the continent by boat, probably a large curragh-like boat like the ones used into the 20th century to transport pigs to and from the Aran Islands. We can say this because the wild progenitors of cattle, sheep, wheat, barley and flax are not present in Ireland. And since we also know that wild boar that were present in Mesolithic Ireland were not domesticated in this part of Europe. Likewise, in Britain, where wild aurochsen had been roaming around for millennia, they weren't domesticated there. Cattle domestication took place in the Near East nearly 10,000 years ago, and DNA from early Neolithic cattle found in Britain and Ireland can be traced right back to there. Over the years, by thinking a lot about the monuments and artefacts found in Neolithic Ireland and Britain, I developed this multi-strand model for the Neolithization of Ireland and Britain, featuring multiple movements of farmers in varying numbers, sailing over from different parts of northwest and northern France, where they had already been farming for nearly 1,000 years, and arriving in different parts of Britain and Ireland. The reasons why these people came over ranged from social change back home to perception that there were too many people around. It was overpopulated. And the outcomes also varied. So at the top left, you can see here the first of these movements, which was a short-lived episode featuring a few farmers from Brittany who, around 4,350 BC, fetched up in southwest Ireland with their small numbers of domesticated animals, only to find that the local Mesolithic people who were camping out at Ferreters Cove in County Kerry weren't in the least bit interested in learning how to farm. But instead, they spotted in their cattle a new and delicious source of food that they hunted, killed, cooked, and ate, which is how there came to be bones of domesticated cattle in this Mesolithic Ferreters Cove site, dating to around 4350 BC. Clearly, the farmers had not come in sufficient numbers to create a critical mass, And so in this part of Ireland, the Neolithic came to an early end until other farming groups arrived a few centuries later. And if we go back to this set of maps, we see that at the top right, I show another group of farmers coming from the Morbihan region of Brittany, southeast Brittany there. This time probably around 4000 BC, and this is the group that I'll be mainly talking about in this lecture. But there are other incomers who are relevant to our story about the Druid Stone. So these people, originally from Nord-Pas-de-Calais, they originally sailed from there at various times between 4,200 and 3,800, arriving at various points around the south and east coast of Britain, and then rapidly spreading, probably from southwest Scotland, into Ireland, sailing across the North Channel in their hide-covered boats. And we refer to these people by the term carinated bowl Neolithic, from the distinctive kind of pottery that they used. And I'll be saying a little bit more about these people in a moment. Finally, as you can see at the bottom right, there were yet others who made the shorter crossing from Normandy to southwest and southern England, but there's no time to talk about them tonight. To cut a long story short, each of these groups brought with them their traditions of how to deal with the dead, and also their own distinctive style of pottery. So the carinated bowl Neolithic people brought with them a tradition of building rectangular houses, and the first groups to arrive in an area will build these huge communal houses like this one at Ballintoy in Aberdeenshire, over 20 metres long, and there's one that's been excavated in County Derry recently. And these were for several families to live in together until they felt sufficiently well established in an area to bud off into smaller individual farmsteads, where they would build houses at roughly half this size. They brought over with them the tradition of making this kind of pottery, the so-called carinated bowl pottery, and also this novel type of arrowhead, the leaf-shaped arrowhead, and also the range of domesticated plants and animals, which of course you wouldn't come in a boat with a fully grown ox. You would bring them as little babies, so calves and piglets and lammies. So they also exploited some wild resources, and indeed they may well have introduced red deer to Ireland. Very interesting. How did they deal with their dead? Well, either they would cremate them in an open-air pyre, as they did at Lyle's Hill in County Antrim, or in some cases they built a rectangular timber mortuary structure for laying out the bodies of selected members of the community. And then they burnt these down and they covered them by long rectangular or trapezoidal mounds, as they did at Ballymacaldrick, again in County Antrim, where a timber monument was then converted into a stone one and became a court tomb. And indeed, this timber tradition is the origin of both the court tombs and the portal tombs that we see in such large numbers in Ireland, particularly in the northern half of the island. And another tradition that these farmers brought with them was that they knew how to find and exploit the best flint going. And in the south of England, they dug deep, deep flint mines, like this one here at Sisbury, just like the ones they had back home in France. So when they got to Antrim, with its wonderful flint, they were really, really happy. And I gather from Cormac McSparran that there is a flint mine known in County Antrim with shafts. And it's quite a recent find. And it's nowhere near as deep as this one in Sussex. We also know from a site in northeast England called Street House that they were producing salt in industrial quantities to exchange for other goods. And finally, these incomers brought with them precious green treasures from the magic mountains far away. Axe heads of jadeite and other rocks from the North Italian Alps, including these examples found at Raimochi in County Donegal and at Movanaher in County Derry. And in the words of the famous Marks and Spencer's ad, these weren't just axe heads. They were treasured heirlooms believed to have magical properties because they didn't know where the Alps were, but mountains were associated with the gods and the ancestors. So if you've got a piece of that place, it is imbued with magical power and it can protect you on your dangerous sea journeys. And I mean, they were perfectly good. You could use them for chopping down trees, but they didn't dream of doing that. And the fact that they came from mountains, because they would have had legends of these wonderful places from where they came, lies behind the fascination with exploiting rock from mountain sources in Ireland and in Britain, such as the porcelainite from Tívbulia, and also you can get it from Brockley on Rathlin Island as well. Anywho, I'm delighted to report that recent developments in archaeological science have proved that my multi-strand model for the introduction of farming to these islands is correct. Hooray! DNA analysis of Neolithic human remains from Ireland and Britain has demonstrated without any shadow of doubt that we are indeed dealing with the arrival of immigrant farming communities from the continent who introduced farming to Britain and Ireland. As you can see from this genetic map of pre and post 4000 BC people whose ancestry goes back to the first farmers in the Near East. And we can also say that these incoming farmers will have looked different from the indigenous Mesolithic communities. They will have been slightly lighter skinned than them, although still significantly darker skinned than white Caucasians living in Ireland and Britain today. And they were also more likely to have brown eyes than blue eyes. So there you are, no. Yeah. But let's return to the Druid Stone and why it is so important to our story, and particularly to the Breton strand of Neolithization. In thinking about the various funerary traditions of these incoming farming groups, the small, simple passage tombs and closed megalithic chambers that are relatively abundant around the coast of Northern Ireland particularly fascinated me, because these kinds of monument have a wide distribution in Atlantic Britain and Ireland. And as you can see here, you can find exactly the same kind of monument if you go to Carramore in County Sligo, where there's an entire cemetery of them, or to Achnacribeg near Oban in Western Scotland, or to Carrick Samson in southwest Wales. There are even a couple of possible candidates in Cornwall, not shown on this map. The excavation of two of these monuments, one in Wales and one in Scotland, really fired my interest in them. The redoubtable Welsh archaeologist Frances Lynch, who is still going strong in her late 80s, was the first person to point out just how similar these megalithic tombs are, not only to each other, but also to several tombs in Brittany, especially in the Morbihan region, marked here with a star. It was Frances who published a version of this distribution map way back in 1975. And work in Brittany since then has shown that simple passage tombs were being built there between around 4,300 and 3,900 BC. Was it conceivable then that around 6,000 years ago, farmers had sailed up the Atlantic facade, settled at various points along the coast of Western Britain and Ireland, and built these monuments for their dead? The second excavation that really got me hooked on these kinds of megalithic monument was the late great Graham Ritchie's account of his dig at Achnacribeg, north of Oban on the west coast of Scotland. Here, a small closed polygonal chamber with a round, very, very low round cairn. They added to it then a simple passage tomb, and they extended the cairn to make it look like a pear shape. And unfortunately, both of the chambers had been emptied out at some unknown point in the past, but the looters missed a bit in the passage tomb, and sherds from 4 pots, including this beautiful decorated bowl, with its rainbow motif, were found, along with a piece of rock crystal, which, as you know, if you hold it up to the light, it refracts the light into the colours of the rainbow. And of course, you know, for prehistoric people, there would be symbolic significance. So the rainbow is what links this world with the world of the gods. Very, very appropriate for something in a grave. Although Graham Ritchie didn't realise at the time that there was a French connection in this pottery, it was clear to the French archaeologist Gérard Bayou in 1975 that this was a classic Breton-style pot of late Castellic type, as found mostly in Morbihan, but also in Normandy, as you can see here. This one is from a passage tomb in Virville in Normandy, dating to between 4,300 and 3,900. And yeah, moreover, fellow French archaeologist Serge Cassen has pointed out that rock crystals are also found in these similar tombs in Brittany. And of course, he said that this would be a symbol of the connection between this world and the world of the gods. So, all in all, a strong case was building up to suggest that these types of monument in Britain and Ireland had indeed been built by settlers from Brittany. And in 1986, it makes me feel very old, I published this article called Megaliths and Megalomania in the Journal of Irish Archaeology, setting out my hypothesis that these simple monuments had been built by Breton farmers and that they stood at the beginning of a long and complicated sequence of passage tomb development in Ireland and also in Scotland, that culminated in Ireland in the construction, nearly 1,000 years later, of these magnificent, huge passage tombs of the Boyne Valley, Newgrange and Knowth, as you see here, and also at Dowth, and also Queen Maeve's Cairn on Knocknarea in Sligo. My argument was and remains that there developed over the centuries a process of competitive, conspicuous consumption between the passage tomb builders, whereby folks were competing to build bigger and better and more complex and elaborate passage tombs for housing and honouring their dead. And here are a couple of examples of what I mean. So in County Sligo, I'd argue that the sequence starts with the small closed chambers and simple passage tombs of the Carramore cemetery, which I'd place around 4,000 or 3,900. By around 3,500 BC, as we know from radiocarbon dating, people had built this much larger and imposing passage tomb slap bang in the middle of the Carramore cemetery. And then, probably around 3,200 BC, this was trumped by the enormous Queen Maeve's Cairn on the summit of Knocknarea, which sort of towers over the Carramore cemetery below. Here you can see a similar thing happening in the passage tomb cemetery at Loch Crew in County Meath, with the smaller, simpler passage tombs then being succeeded by bigger, more elaborate ones with passage tomb art, sacred designs pecked into their stones. And within a single monument on Baltinglass Hill in County Wicklow, you can see how it started as a small, simple chamber here, radiocarbon dated to around 3,800, then was successively enlarged and then had a fancy passage tomb added around 3,200 BC. The sequence of tomb building within the Boyne Valley is especially fascinating because in their quest to make their huge passage tombs extra special and get one up over their competitors, the tomb builders, members of the elite, were travelling long distances, bringing back exotic ideas. The people who converted a small passage tomb, that was originally that kind of size there, into the giant that is Knowth Tomb 1 West around 3,200 BC, travelled to the Morbihan region of Brittany. Yes, there's another link with Brittany. And deliberately kinked the passage, there, to make it look like a Breton à l'écoudé, which is an angled passage tomb. Moreover, in that same grave, they carved this. It's a supernatural-looking guardian figure, possibly a stylized female figure. And this was pecked into an upright at the entrance to the tomb itself, along the passageway. And it bears an unmistakable resemblance to the guardian figures in Breton angled passage tombs. And it's also been suggested that the very high relief style of the elaborate passage tomb decoration that you get at Newgrange and Knowth had been influenced from this fantastic Breton passage tomb at Gavrinis, again in the Morbihan area of Brittany. And there were more distant links as well with Iberia, would you believe? This tiny little foot-shaped carved pebble found at Newgrange has its only and close parallels among the Argalo-type idols in northwest Spain. And the so-called stone idol from Knowth has its only parallels in the stone idols that you find in the Alentejo, around Lisbon. I mean, this is amazing distances to be sailing. And we also know that people from Orkney, they sailed to the continent as well, and they brought back the Orkney vole, but that's another story. And here you can see some of the more of the splendours of the Boyne Valley mega passage tombs at Newgrange and Knowth. Newgrange was famously constructed so that the rising sun on and around midwinter solstice, the shortest day of the year, would shine through a roof box along the long passage and light up the chamber inside, thereby bringing to life the spirits of the very important people buried inside and helping to ensure that the days would get longer again. something which is so important to farming communities. Moreover, recent DNA analysis of the human remains found in Irish passage tombs and related sites has shown that there are familial connections between people buried hundreds of kilometres apart from each other and over the course of several centuries, which suggests that we are indeed dealing with a particular group of people, the passage tomb people, if you have to use that term, which are distinct from most of the people who are buried in Ireland's court and portal tombs. And most spectacularly, DNA has also shown that one man buried in Newgrange was the offspring of an incestuous union. This is fascinating because it suggests that perhaps the people responsible for building these mega passage tombs were maintaining the purity of their dynastic bloodline by marrying in the family within a narrow gene pool. This is exactly the sort of behaviour that's well known from historical contexts among the aristocracy across Europe. Just think of the Habsburgs with their distinctive chin, for example. And in my opinion, it reinforces the idea that the people responsible for building these massive passage tombs were the elite in a by then very hierarchical society. But let's return to the beginning of the sequence of passage tomb development, since this is where the Druid Stone comes in. One rather important loose end in this model is the question of exactly when the earliest, simplest monuments in the passage tomb tradition were built, as opposed to when they were used or reused. Back in the 1970s, 80s and 90s, a Swedish archaeologist, Göran Bornholt, and his team excavated several of the tombs in the Carramore Cemetery, and they got quite a few radiocarbon dates from charcoal, including some surprisingly early ones. Bornholt accepted these at face value, and he argued that these monuments were built in the late 5th millennium BC by the local Mesolithic people. However, Stefan Berg, who was a member of that team, has since done a sample-by-sample critique of these dates and has convincingly concluded that not a single one of these is reliable. It can be tricky with charcoal. Stefan then worked with Robert Hensey to date a series of bone and antler pins from 2 of the tombs in the Carramore Cemetery and concluded from their 25 dates that the tombs were in use between around 3600 and 3200. They didn't believe that these pins related to the reuse of pre-existing monuments that were already old, but I believe the jury's still out on that one. Elsewhere in Ireland, a radiocarbon dating programme led by Professor Rick Schulting on the development of the passage tomb at Baltinglass Hill in Wicklow, as you've seen before, established that its initial small and simple passage tomb was in use around 3800 BC. And then it was aggrandised around 3600 and then changed again at 3200. And in Western Scotland, my own radiocarbon dating of cremated bone from a closed chamber at Molee, just a few kilometres from Achnacribeg, showed that this monument was in use around 3700 BC. But there was clearly still a need for much more dating to see if we can pin down the date when this tradition of building closed chambers and simple passage tombs arrived in Ireland and Britain, and to see when individual monuments were actually constructed. And this is where the Druid Stone comes in. And here's one of David Craig's fantastic photos. I'm so delighted to say that David is here in the audience, and we're so grateful to you for what you've been doing. It's one of several very, very similar tombs around the Northern Irish coast, especially on along the Antrim and Derry coast, as you can see from these maps. And it was the subject of a week-long excavation by John Mogi in 1939, the results of which he published in Volume 4 of the Ulster Journal of Archaeology in 1941, during the war. John Mogi is perhaps best known for the work that he subsequently did on the provision of social housing in Northern Ireland, but clearly he did several excavations before he sort of pivoted around and his career took a completely different path. This monument had previously attracted the attention of antiquaries, including John du Bourdieu, who recorded it in 1811, and John Borlase, who recorded it in 1888. The early accounts refer to there having been 2 concentric rings of stone surrounding the chamber, but only parts of the outer ring now survive. And you can just about see some of them here. So there, for example. And it's very likely that the others were used in the construction of the townland boundary wall between Ballintoy and Macroboy, whenever that was. Mogi assumed that the monument had also been covered with a cairn, whose stones also got used to build the wall, but we'll come back to that in a moment. More recently, Harry Welsh, in his great survey of the megalithic monuments of Northern Ireland, has pointed out that the Druid Stone seems to be aligned on the midsummer solstice sunset. So it's worth going up there and seeing, the sun setting there. Back to the 1939 dig. Mogi found that the inside of the chamber had been emptied out long time ago, and the area immediately to the west of it had also been disturbed. So he focused on digging on the areas to the north, south and west of the chamber and around the curb, leaving the shaded areas in his plan unexcavated. What he discovered was that, to prepare the site for building the passage tomb, people stripped the topsoil and old ground surface off down to the level of the boulder clay, or in some areas the bedrock, in order to create a level surface. The upright stones of the chamber were then set directly onto this level surface and supported on the outside by packing stones. In other words, they didn't dig holes for holding the stones in position, which is a bit of a kind of engineeringly dodgy thing to do. And this fact undoubtedly contributed to the subsequent collapse of one of the uprights supporting the heavy capstone. The most notable feature to be revealed by Mogi's excavation was a black charcoal-rich layer that you can see here, running there and running there again, capped by a layer of small stones that are almost like paving kind of thing. And these were found in the undisturbed areas around the chamber. And it also seemed to be associated with areas of burning, probably from fires that were lit in small hollows. And this burning had turned the top of the surface of the boulder clay purple, and significantly, as it turned out, some of the packing stones for the uprights also showed signs of burning. Stratigraphic clue here. Within this black layer, Mogi found quite a lot of flint, much of it unworked, but including a few finely worked objects, including a fragment of a leaf-shaped arrowhead that you can see here. Further flint, mostly unworked, was found among and above the small stones that capped the black layer, and he reckoned it must have been collected in White Park Bay nearby. There were also fragments of cremated bone, human bone, which was identified by Professor Walmsley of Queen's University Anatomy Department as belonging to an adult, but he couldn't tell whether it was a man or a woman. Quite a bit of charcoal was also present in the black layer, and Mogi sent 4 samples off to a Mr. Orr, J.Y. Orr, of the Royal Botanic Gardens of Edinburgh, who identified them as being of oak, hazel and willow. Of greatest interest to me as a pottery specialist, however, were the sherds of undecorated early Neolithic pottery from the black layer, which Professor Eston Evans said had belonged to 5 or 6 different pots, along with one intriguing problematical sherd of thinware. There was also evidence for later activity. One early Bronze Age type sherd came from a disturbed area, close to where he also found a copper coin that must have been dropped just in the last few centuries. From my point of view as a pottery nerd, the early Neolithic pottery was particularly interesting because it clearly belongs to the carinated bowl tradition and not to the Breton late Castellic tradition, which is what one might expect to find in a simple passage tomb. Carinated bowl pottery like this, in contrast, is the type of pottery associated with court and portal tombs and settlements here. Yeah? But here what we had is a passage tomb with carinated bowl pottery. How is this possible? This fact had really bugged me ever since I worked on my PhD 40 years ago. How sad is that? What was the black layer in which this pottery had been found? And what was going on here? Like many other people, including Humphrey Case, I had assumed that the black layer must have predated the erection of the passage tomb and was perhaps associated with purification rituals to prepare for the tomb's construction. Since we know that carinated bowl pottery was in use in Ireland possibly from as early as 4000 BC, I assumed that this meant that the passage tomb had to be later than that, later than the carinated bowl pottery. How very intriguing to find a Breton-style passage tomb being built after an episode associated with pottery belonging to a different group of people, whose ancestors had come from a different part of France. I was keen to get to the bottom of this and see if we could get a radiocarbon date from Mogie's finds of charcoal or cremated bone. So last summer, I contacted Greer Ramsey in the Ulster Museum to ask whether Mogie's finds were stored there. Sadly, Greer could find no reference to them on the museum database, so we both assumed that they can't have made it into the museum. The ever-helpful Nick Wright of Ballycastle Museum also confirmed that they weren't in that museum, and Historic Environment Division staff also said it wasn't in their store. Then I went to the Royal Botanic Gardens in Edinburgh and asked if they still had the charcoal samples that had been identified. Tragically, they said that all samples sent in for identification in those days were thrown away after identification. Yikes. Oy, oy, oy. And we also don't know whether a similar fate was met by the cremated human bone that was studied by Professor Walmsley. So there was only one way to find out when the Druid Stone was built, and that was by doing fresh, small-scale excavation. But this comes at a cost, and where could we get the funds to do that? I'm delighted to say that the wonderful Historic Environment Division's Research and Revival Scheme was the answer to this maiden's prayer. This fabulous annual scheme offers grants up to £10,000 for heritage-related research and other work. The successful candidates are notified in October, and the work has to be completed by the end of March. So I duly filled in the application form on behalf of Archaeology Scotland and applied for scheduled monument consent to permission to dig, and gave our project the name From Brittany to Ballintoy. Imagine my delight when this got the green light. Hooray! And we were allocated a case officer, Stephanie McMullen, who has been super helpful. And so we set to at top speed. Securing this grant was truly game-changing, because it meant not only could we do a targeted keyhole excavation at the Druid Stone to a professional standard using cutting-edge methods, but we could also do much more than that. We could commission David Craig to make 3D models and drone images of all of the simple passage tombs and closed chambers in Northern Ireland in order to improve their documentation and raise public awareness of this fascinating set of monuments. We could also help the local community to understand better the archaeological treasures on their doorstep. And we could provide information that teachers could use in schools. Perhaps we could even contribute to sustainable heritage tourism. Most importantly, we could feed this information into several other current research projects that would help people to get a sense of the wider archaeological context and importance of these remarkable monuments on an international basis. In particular, our project complements and contributes to a larger project run by Archaeology Scotland on Scotland's earliest megalithic monuments, which is funded by a £50,000 grant from the Audrey Henschel Legacy Fund. Audrey was a wonderful archaeologist who created a 2-volume survey of all of the chamber tombs in Scotland, off her own bat, in her own time, my goodness me. And when she died, she left a generous legacy to the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland to fund research on Scottish prehistory. This project focuses on the simple passage tombs and closed chambers of Scotland within their broader context. And the project will be excavating 3 monuments, including Achnacribeg, this year to try and get information on when they were all built. It's also creating an online compendium of all the information on all of the sites belonging to this tradition in Britain and Ireland, including 3D models, and giving background information on similar monuments in Brittany, so that folks will understand the international nature of the phenomenon. But our From Brittany to Ballintoy project will also benefit our colleagues in the Republic of Ireland, who are currently in the process of submitting a bid to secure UNESCO World Heritage status for the passage tomb landscape of County Sligo. And we've secured also for our project the generous assistance of Professor Marta Díaz-Guardamino's international research project on Europe's earliest megalithic monuments, which has enabled us to apply a dating technique called optically stimulated luminescence, or OSL, to be used alongside radiocarbon dating to determine when the Druid Stone was erected. I won't try and explain the technique of OSL, but basically it looks at light trapped in quartz particles in the soil that got buried when a monument was built. Finally, our project fits in with a broader but unfunded research initiative on prehistoric monuments in Scotland, Ireland and the Isle of Man called Bointa Brodgar. So all in all, we are massively extending the reach and impact of our From Brittany to Ballintoy project. So what did we find when we did our wee dig in January? I mean, when I say we, actually it was Cormac who did all the digging, because it's such a teeny tiny, you're going to get one person in the trench. And ours was a keyhole excavation with a 1 by 1 metre trench located immediately outside the chamber in an area untouched by Mogi. It was designed to be big enough to get stratigraphic information and datable material, but leaving plenty of the site unexcavated for future generations with even better technology. Cormac started by stripping off the topsoil, initially leaving a strip immediately adjacent to the uprights for the OSL people to do their sampling. And immediately under the topsoil, he came down on a layer of small laid stones, forming a kind of paving, which corresponds to what Mogi had found as a capping for the black layer below. And if you look closely, you'll see that this layer doesn't extend over the whole of the trench. Instead, here is a little pit that got cut through it. We'll come back to this hole in a moment. And also note the packing stones, for the upright there in the corner. Beneath the stone paving, Cormac found the black charcoal-rich layer that Mogi had found elsewhere, and it contained quite a bit of flint, a few sherds of undecorated early Neolithic pottery, and fragments of cremated human bone. And Cormac gave this layer number 104. You'll also notice that more of the packing stones are now visible, supported by a sloping bank of heaped up boulder clay. Significantly, Cormac was able to show that the black layer and the stone paving above it were laid down after the packing stones for the chamber were put in place. So this means that it must post-date the erection of the monument. This is a hugely significant finding for two reasons. Firstly, it shows that the early Neolithic carinated bowl pottery is later than the passage tomb. And secondly, it shows that there cannot ever have been any cairn associated with the passage tomb. At this level, Cormac also exposed more of the filling of the pit that had been dug through part of the black layer. And significantly, within its fill, he found several sherds of decorated pottery, which I was able to identify as coming from a beaker that probably dates to somewhere between 2300 and 2000 BC, that is the late Chalcolithic or early Bronze Age. So this means that over 1500 years after the black layer was deposited, somebody came along, dug a hole through it, and put parts of a broken beaker pot in. After he'd removed the black layer, Cormac came onto more of the boulder clay that had been heaped up to support the packing stones of the passage tomb uprights. And he found evidence for burning in situ as the clay was burnt. And digging a little deeper down, he found some depressions in the now natural boulder clay. And these contained grey silt. And here in a diagrammatic form is a cross-section through the various layers. The passage tomb chamber is to your right, and layer 101 is the topsoil. And you can see the pit with the beaker just here. Okay. Finds-wise, here are most of the flint finds. And these are after we were staying in the lovely cottage in Main Street, and in the evenings we washed the finds. Some of these flints came from among and just above the paving stones, while most were found in the black layer. It consists mostly of unburnt and unworked pieces, but there are a few humanly worked pieces and a few bits that show signs of scorching or burning. There's also one teeny tiny bit of quartz. And here are the fragments of cremated bone from the same layers, with one bit from the boulder clay. They're all really small, but osteologist Lisa White has now cleaned them up and has done her report and says that there's at least one person represented, probably an adolescent. Along with Professor Walmsley's adult from Mogi's dig, this suggests at least two people had been represented. One of the bone fragments is large enough to be radiocarbon dated, and I will be submitting it tomorrow afternoon to the Chrono Laboratory in Queens. And we're also hoping to get some isotope analysis done on the cremated bone, because this can tell us whether the people had grown up locally or were incomers to the area. Very interesting. And in addition to the bone, plenty of charcoal was found, and this would be good for radiocarbon dating too. 5 very small sherds of early Neolithic pottery were found, of which you can see 2 here. One is definitely a rim, the other one probably a rim. These are of carinated bowl pottery of the same type as the sherds that Mogi found. And they will have come from pots that are similar to this beautiful one from Ballintoy court tomb that you see on the right. And as I said before, we know that this pottery was in use from at least as early as 3,800, if not 4,000. And it's unlikely to be any later than 3,600. And here again are the beaker sherds, decorated with a complex incised design. When complete, it would have looked a little bit like this one, this beaker from Largantay wedge tomb in County Derry. So all in all, that's a pretty good haul from a 1 by 1 metre trench and a 2.5 day excavation. The post-excavation work is proceeding right now, and we'll be getting radiocarbon dates in a couple of months' time, so watch this space. And work has also started on processing the sediment samples taken by Dr Florian Cousseau of Durham University for OSL dating. And he came over with his colleague, Professor Chris Scarr. Getting the OSL samples can only be described as a bit of a palaver, as it had to be done in the dark. So on the left, you can see the black tarpaulins that were stretched over the trench where Florian was taking the samples. So he was underneath all this. And thanks again to Grace for providing one of these two tarpaulins for us. So Florian was working in the dark. In the middle, you can see one of the sample tubes that they rammed in. And then this is a dosimeter. Don't ask me what it was doing, but it's part of their process. Whatevs. And also, he took samples at 3 centimetre intervals right the way down the whole section. And so by looking at this, the light in the grains here, they can say whether the grains here are significantly older than the grains there. The magic of science. And by the way, Florian is also an expert on megalithic architecture, and he was able to shed new light on the stones used to construct the passage tomb. And he also discovered that Mogi's plan and measurements aren't absolutely correct. He was able to confirm that 3 of the uprights had been made using quarried basalt, almost certainly obtained locally, and set with their flatter quarried surfaces facing inwards. And the capstone is a glacial erratic, but here you see 2 huge flake scars from when it must have been sort of manhandled into position. We can tell this had been a glacial erratic because these are glacial striae made by stones in the bottom of a glacier that were rolling over the stone millions and millions of years ago. And he also suggested and he also found some little graffiti, very nice, very well made, probably 19th century, I would say, from the style of the writing. He also suggested that maybe the capstone had been shaped, perhaps, and also this stone here, these are big flake scars there. So maybe they were trying to, he said, oh, maybe this is a little bit like a human figure, or, again, the jury's out about that, but it gives us food for thought. So now we're busy trying to build our overall interpretation of the site. It looks certain that the passage tomb was erected before, certainly 3600 BC, possibly before 3800. And then after it was built, we don't know how long after, other people with different French ancestry came along and carried out their own funerary rites there. What they were doing, they were appropriating an ancient monument, and they were rebranding it with their own culture. Yeah, which is great. So first of all, they built fires around the passage tomb, to make a little dramatic scene. And then either they cremated at least 2 people in situ, or more likely, they cremated them somewhere else, gathered up all of the stuff from the pyre and brought it and deposited it around the outside of the passage tomb. Yeah? Really, really interesting. Either whole remains or token deposits of the bones, along with carinated bowl pottery and flints in this black layer, before sealing it over with a low paving. And then, 1,000 years later, somebody else came along, dug through that layer, and deposited parts of a beaker. As I say, watch this space for details of the dates when they come through. And one more fun thing. Just the other day, I found a reference by Humphrey Case in an article in 1961 on Irish Neolithic pottery to the pottery from Mogi's excavation being in the Ulster Museum, which in those days was called the Belfast Museum and Art Gallery. So, back on the phone to Greer, and he's kindly been having a fertile through, and this Thursday I'm going to go and have a fertile through the stores there. So you never know, Mogi's finds, or some of them, might turn up after all. Finally, the other main part of our project has featured the superb photographic work of David Craig, who has been going around recording all of the simple passage tombs and closed chambers in Northern Ireland. And here is a still from one of his fantastic 3D models, and which you can access on Sketchfab, and you can whiz it around, you can turn it upside down, you can do all sorts of things with it. It's just fantastic, like. And here are a couple of the drone shots, and these are really good for showing the broader topography and the environment and the landscape, and the wonderful way in which these, it's almost they're looking out towards the sea. Yeah? So these people who came in and settled, they're burying their dead looking out towards the sea, which had carried them over in the first place. And also whizzy stuff, which I personally don't understand, but David can explain to us. You have been able to manipulate your aerial drone photographs. Would you like to say just a couple of words?
The traditional way of getting this sort of information is a technique called LiDAR. If you've ever heard of it. It involves a very expensive plane, very expensive pilot, very expensive gadget. It fires a laser down to the ground and it bounces back up to the plane, and they record that height, and they do that all over a big area. And it creates imagery like this, which is really, this one's the normal Google Earth type colours, but these are other ones. The elevation that's measured is translated into colours. So it means that blue is low and red is high in this one, for example. So you can start to see the levels. I use a drone, which is an off-the-shelf drone. It's quite cheap. I'm not hard to pay, not at all, compared to these very expensive other ways of doing it. So these are all just variations which the archaeologists can basically exaggerating any height that there is. And there was a very slight rise in the ground. Using this technique, it kind of gives an image of it being higher, so you can actually locate it and see patterns of circles or squares, things that need to be examined. So this is just different ways of looking at the same thing. This is all one drone flight. The drone flew up and down at 400 feet, taking a photograph every couple of seconds, about 300 photographs per flight, and then it stitches it all together and creates these lovely pictures, which the archaeologists, not me, archaeologists can interpret.
Thank you very much, David. That's great. And you've done this for every, yes, give me in. Wonderful. And you've done this for every single one of the sites. And it's so important because hidden here in the landscape are other sites. Not necessarily contemporary with the tomb, but all sorts of different periods. So it's a wonderful, wonderful resource that you're building up for everybody to enjoy. Also, here's Clegna. I hope that's the right way to pronounce it. Clegna? Clegna. And it's a sad story because previously a farmer had quarried right up to one of the stones. And you can see here the one that's circled, that's going to plummet anytime soon. And when it does, the whole monument will collapse. So this is a conservation nightmare, but it's a real wake-up call to people, basically to HED. What do you do to protect the fantastic archaeological heritage of this area? Expensive, it would be expensive to fix it, but you don't really want to let these things die, do you? Here's another one, Lemnabeg, and you can see from these pictures how similar these monuments are, these ones in this particular area. And also, eagle-eyed David, you don't just take pictures, you find artifacts as well. This fantastic end scraper was found not far away from the tomb there. Then at Craig's, yes, another variant on the same thing. So, yeah, beautiful monument. And then at West Hall, we went up there this lovely afternoon. This is fabulous. And it's so great to be able to see it from the sky because you can see all the details of the construction of the monument. And this is at the old RAF station there, yeah, where it says, "Do not enter, dangerous building." Well, this is a dangerous building. Yeah. We did have it, yes. And then this is super, super exciting. Cormac Burke, who again used to work in the Ulster Museum, discovered this about 4 years ago. And Grace and David have been working with Harry Welsh to explore it. It's a collapsed monument that nobody had known about before. So no antiquarian stuff, no folklore, no nothing as far as we know. And unfortunately, it's about, 6 meters away from the cliff edge, so a health and safety nightmare. But by golly, what's a site that is full of promise. And I'm delighted to say that the HED are so pleased with the way our own project has gone on Druid Cairn. I'm very tempted to apply for another 10,000 quid so that we can then do a proper excavation, do an excavation here, yeah, to see if what's there. So again, watch this space. Oh, and then, yeah, Ballintoy. This one is right slap bang in the middle of the huge henge, which is much, much later than the simple passage tomb. This is just, just outside. It's in South Belfast, yeah, and it's the most exquisite little monument. Of course, it was rifled in the past, so there's no artifacts. Although they did find cremated bone apparently in the 19th century. So thank you, David, and thank you to all of these people and these institutions and organisations. It's, without whom this would be absolutely impossible. And it's such a blast. This is something I've wanted to do for the last 40 years, and I am the happiest bunny alive. So, and thank you for coming and listening, and happy to answer any questions.